I'm going to comment on Chapter 13 of Lila, An Inquiry into Morals by Robert M. Pirsig. So in Chapter 12, Phaedrus determines that his metaphysics of quality is a moral system, because every pattern and every level is migrating towards dynamic quality. And dynamic quality, to engage with dynamic quality, to transform, is the act of bettering, you could say. So let's read that conclusion real quick. So what Phaedrus was saying was that not just life, but everything is an ethical activity. It is nothing else. When inorganic patterns of reality create life, the metaphysics of quality postulates that they've done so because it's better, and that this definition of betterness, this beginning response to dynamic quality, is an elementary unit of ethics upon which all right and wrong can be based. And so as the patterns evolve and as evolution progresses, evolution is progressing towards the better. Lamarck would say, the evolutionist before Darwin would say, that evolution is toward perfection. In this chapter 13, we're going to show specifically how this moral system actually works. And it is both simple and complicated. Historically, every effort to unite science and ethics has been a disaster. You can't paste a moral system on top of a pile of amoral objective matter. The amoral objective matter never needs this paste job. It always sloughs it off as superfluous. So what he said in the last chapter is basically every level is exercising choice. So even if inorganic molecules are not conscious, there is something in them, in the inorganic patterns, that are migrating towards dynamic quality. And this occurs at every level. All patterns, no matter what they are trying to overcome, which is generally laws and restrictions specific to that level, they're trying to overcome these restrictions and flourish and transform into something more flexible and more free. And this is, of course, how carbon was used as a vehicle to latch out of the inorganic level into something more dynamic, which was life. It also means that when we do science, as dead as what we believe we are studying is, the movements of these organic substances operate as if they were choosing what was better. Even though you can't possibly compare the way choices are made at the different levels, everything is going in the same direction, you could say. So that is how he's uniting, rather than, and we're going to explain how science tries to glean morals out of inorganic matter now, and the way science is done now. But what he's saying is, if you have quality operating at every level, and the choices made by the constituents of that level, while very different, are always toward the better, then this betterness all the way through is how ethics and science can be united. Even if matter wasn't a low-grade form of morality, there would still be no metaphysical need to show how morals are derived from it for this reason. So what he's implying here is that there would be an attempt to glean morals from the organic level, and that means that this is the same thing we've been talking about, which is the materialist, rationalist viewpoint ultimately sees everything as derived from particles. So some determinism concerning morals, because there's a direct line from these particles all the way up to most intelligent human being, let's just say someone they love, Richard Dawkins. So some determinism concerning morals, meaning that the biological level is a direct expression of matter. There's a direct linear evolution from matter to biology. And we all know one day we will find the atomic basis of consciousness. It's just a matter of time. So evolutionary biology and psychology gives us a logical scientific answer as to why we have morals at all. They are obviously, according to evolutionary biology, some complex expression, or evolutionary psychology, of some animal behavior that we've inherited, because there's that direct line. Thus, science can explain them away, which is, of course, the explaining away of the social level, which is where our human morals actually come from. Human morals emerge as a counter to the biological by keeping it under control, and then they take off from there and go their own way, and into the domain of religious morality, which starts as a counter to the biological, and you're going to see a bit of that in, Leviticus, say, and so you'll be able to see the roots of that opposition, and way early, of course, in rituals that are meant to, keep biological forces at bay, way, way earlier. But religious morality ultimately is its own thing. And there's a lot of trial and error that goes into sophisticated religious morality like Christianity. This is, you've seen Pajot and Peterson talk about how layered the moral systems are, and how this is a long time understanding and perception of patterns that repeat and repeat and repeat until they become the constituents of religious morality. It is verboten in science to see this social level, and which contains this religious morality, in any other way than objective, like the objective anthropology. So no real understanding is ever derived from this level. And remember the big mess that the anthropologists got into earlier in the book, trying to understand morality objectively from a scientific point of view, and that same objective point of view that you would study, the same objective lens with which you would study matter. And this is the big mistake that Pirsig keeps pointing out. So let me restate this. In the scientific worldview, morals ultimately come from dead matter, of which biology is comprised, and biology develops social behavior the same way that dead matter became life, by chance. So chance is the word that is used in the scientific worldview. By natural selection, which is obviously chance. So that explains why the intellectual level, when it conceives of the social level, it conceives of it as some variation of biology that just kind of arose out of good luck, let's just say, and tends to dismiss social morals altogether as primitive and unnecessary. And we see the chaos that has ensued from this viewpoint, because these religious morals are starting to infiltrate into our world. We don't have control of them. This is something that is occurring on a level that we contain and that we live in. And we're getting, because we keep trying to materialize these levels that are not material, the topsy-turvy world that Pajot describes is ensuing. And it's kind of the same thing that Pirsig was talking about when the anthropologists tried to have objective anthropology. They ended up with this big mess where they had to backtrack and go back to the metaphysical structure every time they tried to explain anything, and then every anthropologist would have some different opinion of what was universal, for example. So you're getting a situation where you're never going to be able to categorize and contain it, because you're coming at it with the wrong rubric. So in Pirsig's philosophy, replace the word chance with the word quality, and things are going to make a lot more sense. So important to remember that the levels are separate. They are their own thing, and so are the morals contained within those levels. With static patterns of value divided into 4 systems, conventional moral patterns have almost nothing to do with inorganic or biological nature. These moral patterns are superimposed upon inorganic nature the way novels are superimposed upon computers. They're more commonly opposed to biological patterns than they are supportive of them. And that is the key to the whole thing. So each level has its own moral code, in which what is moral, what is desirable, is generally, at least at the beginning, a triumph over the lower level. And these codes are discrete. But we make a grave error when it comes to when we try to understand morality this way, and worse, to apply the moral code of one level onto another. What is today conventionally called morality covers only one of these sets of moral codes, the social biological code. In a subject-object metaphysics, this single social biological code is considered to be a minor, subjective, physically non-existent part of the universe. But in the metaphysics quality, all these sets of morals plus another dynamic quality are not only real, they are the whole thing. So that means that the morals of the social level are as important as any of the other levels, or as real. They are static patterns of value, and every static patterns of value is an existent, let's just say, thing. So how do we determine what is moral as the conscious, intelligent beings that we are, capable of actually conceptualizing moral choices via this intellect we have? Well, he says usually the more dynamic level, which means the higher level, takes precedence in any situation where you have to choose between the value system of one level over the other. Just as it is more moral for a doctor to kill a germ than a patient, so it is more moral for an idea to kill a society than it is for society to kill an idea. The morality of one level taking precedence over another level is scientific because of the metaphysical underpinning of the universe is the metaphysics of quality. Then the scientific understanding must parallel this metaphysics. So the science based on the metaphysics of quality is real science, and these choices are replicable, and universal because there is this rubric. When there's a direct conflict between one level or the other, you choose the higher level. Nothing could be more obvious than that. It's like 3 is greater than 2, so it's very scientific. It's going to get a little more complicated than that, but this is the basic outline. When a society is not itself threatened, as in the execution of individual criminals, the issue becomes more complex. In the case of treason or insurrection or war, a criminal's threat to society can be very real, but if an established social structure is not seriously threatened by a criminal, then an evolutionary morality would argue that there is no moral justification for killing him. So what's he talking about here? It is getting confusing. Didn't he say we should never sacrifice intellect for a lower level? And isn't a society a lower level? Well, it gets tricky because you can't make moral decisions that will compromise the supporting level either. So you don't just always choose the higher level. You don't always choose the human, no matter he's done, because the human has the capacity for intellect. Because if you allow this treasoner, say, to live, there's no motivation not to commit treason, and society falls apart. So by not, this isn't a death penalty debate. This is simply an example to demonstrate that if the substrate of these agents of intellect is compromised, which would be the social level, say the nation, then we might have to actually do something about these individual agents who have the capacity for intelligence. The same goes for, say, medicine. You can't just go with the latest and greatest dynamic innovations if these innovations ultimately, for example, end up undermining the body if you can't update them. I did a video about how antibiotics were the latest and greatest, but that squashed every other way of dealing with infection, and it squashes any future way of dealing with infection because all they do within the system is upgrade the antibiotics, and antibiotics are causing tremendous damage to our biological level. So it's not tit for tat. You have to both choose the most dynamic level while at the same time preserving the support of lower levels. Right now is a perfect example. The dynamism of social media, which is a manifestation of intellect, is in fact undermining our societal level by its isolating nature. For example, you see 3 kids hanging out, and they'll be looking at their phones and not talking to each other. And also social media is dividing society in a really serious, bad way. So this great intellectual innovation sequestered in this immune system of money making and data selling and all this stuff that's happened in social media is this great intellectual idea is actually corrupting and dividing society. And it's also undermining our biological level, and this is independent of COVID, obviously, but social media itself, before COVID, was keeping people indoors and sedentary. Then again, there's the immediate dynamism of a platform like Zoom, which actually can connect you during COVID. So again, you have to typically choose the more dynamic level, but also protect the lower level. So you can see how this very simple rubric just becomes a complicated debate, and there's no the whole moral all these moral arguments are dynamic in themselves. What he's talking about with this criminal that he was talking about earlier is is the higher level of intellect that this criminal, this human being that you may kill or may not kill, depending on what he does. You're talking about the higher level of intellect. A human being is a collection of ideas, and these ideas take moral precedence over a society. Ideas are patterns of value. They are at a higher level of evolution than social patterns of values. That human being with his perceptual capacity, in terms of societal change, is an agent of that change. A moral evolution of society must be through the constituent agents within these levels, which means that within the societal or intellectual level, you've got to have a living being with consciousness interacting with dynamic quality. That doesn't mean that the lower levels, like the inorganic level, doesn't have this mechanism, but we're talking about the societal level and the intellectual level, where the constituents are conscious beings. Societies and thoughts and principles themselves are no more than sets of dynamic patterns. These patterns can't by themselves perceive or adjust to dynamic quality. Only a living being can do that. The strongest moral argument against capital punishment is that it weakens a society's dynamic capability, its capability for change and evolution. So again, these patterns, when he says these patterns, it means patterns within the social and intellectual realms. Now he moves on to an idea which is a real can of worms, because how do you decide who is a bad person in society? Very, very often we are lulled into complacency by nice guys who promise stability. And as individuals, we want that biological and social stability. It's not the nice guys who bring about real social change. Nice guys look nice because they're conforming. It's the bad guys who only look nice 100 years later that are the real dynamic force in social evolution. That was the real moral lesson of the Brujo and Zuni. If those priests killed him, they would have done great harm to their society's ability to grow and change. So first of all, let's look at some bad guys who look nice later. And we're looking at people who were maligned at first and who were considered threatening at first, that in fact contributed to the ability of society to evolve. And the first person I think of is Nietzsche, who predicted communism many years ahead of his time, and who was not appreciated for a long time after he made some of these predictions. And I think, though, in this case, Phaedrus is thinking more of people like John Brown, who was considered a terrorist, but whose idea of equality ended up, that notion of equality ended up transforming society for the better. That equality of, or let's just say, freeing the slaves was the highest possible social, intellectual idea as to how to change a society. But at the time, he was considered a real threat. Obviously, the most famous example of this is Jesus Christ, as we all know. And we're all embedded in narratives in the mythos, so we're very influenced by this stuff, and very few people can step outside of this and see the pattern, and only time will tell. So I guess that's why you have to be careful to not be too quick to kill the bad guy. But at the time things are happening, most want to and often do. So this would be the case of martyrs throughout the years, and modern day martyrs. Martin Luther King was offed because he was just too much trouble for the status quo. So the next part of this chapter, he is able to answer Rigel's question as to whether Lila has quality. And we know she has biological quality, and we know she has no social or intellectual quality. Since biological and social patterns have almost nothing to do with each other, Lila does, and Lila does not have quality at the same time. That's exactly the feeling she gives, too, a sort of mixed feeling of quality and no quality at the same time. That was the reason. But what really counts is that she has dynamic quality. She may not be a genius, she may be unpleasant socially, she may be reactive and guided by her biology, and she may just be she just may not be someone you want to be around all the time, but she certainly is interesting. She's unpredictable. We don't know what's coming next, and we don't know how she's going to, switch up our perception of reality in the moment. Like sitting next to a hill that's rumbling and letting off steam here and there. So we know from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance that the descriptions of the actual journey, the topography, the events that happen are often some kind of metaphor for the philosophical musings. For example, doesn't this barge that he's going to describe remind you of Lila, and maybe how someone would try to avoid setting her off? The barge had pipes along the top that meant it was probably carrying oil or chemicals. It was heading toward him. And although he figured there was no danger of collision, he set a course anyway that would give it an even wider separation. So that kind of reminds us of the last sentence, sitting next to a hill rumbling and letting off steam here and there. I mean, I think there is a parallel. I don't know. But you can read into a lot of these descriptions of what is actually going on in his observations. And if you're careful, you can find parallels and metaphors. So in the last part of the chapter, he muses on his revelation, his great revelation about the morality of the levels and the moral system. And I guess you would call this the static latching he was trying to do, getting this idea of these moral levels to solidify more concretely so they can actually be used to understand things. And the way of this evolution is overcoming. Vice, for example, is the biological infiltrating of the social with good feels. But vice can break up families and cause chaos on the social level. At the top are, of course, some of the great intellectual notions of our country, such as equality and democracy, and, of course, free speech, which an authoritarian social pattern seems intent on suppressing right now. We're down to raw tribalism on this one. So using the metaphysics of equality, it's obvious that trying to shut down free speech is immoral, and that the people doing it, of course, would argue that allowing certain kind of speech is undermining the social level. Again, the main takeaway of all this is the separation. As Phaedrus had gotten into them, he had seen that the isolation of these static moral codes was important. They were really little moral empires all of their own, as separate from one another as the static levels whose conflicts they resolved. But what about this fourth morality, dynamic morality? That might be a little confusing. We know what dynamic quality is, but how does it translate as morality? Finally, there's a fourth dynamic morality, which isn't a code. He supposed you could call it a code of art or something like that. But art is usually thought of as such a frill that the title undercuts its importance. The morality of the Brujo and Zuni, that was dynamic morality. And that's what everything is heading towards, or avoiding if they're reluctant to change, if they're too rigid. But dynamic is where the actual transforming events lie. It's that interaction with dynamic quality that causes transformation for the better. And to interact with dynamic morality is to upgrade. Like the stifling of free speech by a lower level is a downgrade. Or at least that is, one way. Like I said, this is one way to interpret the free speech situation we're in. Like, at what point are you going to stifle free speech in order to save society? And I would say that either, both solutions to the free speech situation from this division, one is just let it run and don't worry about it. And the other side is stifle anything that is harmful, and who's to say what is harmful with these people doing the stifling. So what you want to do with dynamic morality is keep the good stuff, but continue the transformational process. So you want to keep free speech, but maybe there is something better about taking off of social media calls to violence, let's just say. So you stop, so maybe there is something dynamic, maybe there's an upgrade to free speech because of the internet. We're in this very strange situation that it's actually more dynamic to take off from the internet certain calls to violence. Maybe these are the equivalent of yelling fire in a movie theater. I don't know. So you see how complicated this can get. But in general, the metaphysics of equality is going to say that if you stifle free speech, then the social level is stifling the dynamic, the higher level, which is free speech. And then that is a kind of moral evil. And that's where the notion of evil comes, is the conflict amongst and between the levels. What was emerging was that the static patterns that hold one level of organization together are often the same patterns that another level of organization must fight to maintain its own existence. Morality is not a simple set of rules. It's a very complex struggle of conflicting patterns of values. This conflict is the residue of evolution. And as new patterns evolve, they come into conflict with old ones. Each stage of evolution creates in its wake a wash of problems. So the idea of good and evil, like I said, stem out of these conflicts. Like for Rigel, Lila's penchant for biological is evil. It threatens the social level. But Rigel's rigid and square Victorian morality is evil to Phaedrus's intellectual, which values freedom to upgrade the social code. Rigel is stuck in that code, and any intellectual updates are not welcome. It's a cultural immune system, and that's a form of evil in the metaphysics quality, but it's not that simple, although it's a very good example. The mistake we're making today is one that we think of the social morals as stupid and archaic and can just be dispensed with. And Phaedrus articulates that in this statement. Everybody thinks that those Victorian moral codes are stupid and evil, or old-fashioned at least, except maybe a few religious fundamentalists and ultra-right-wingers and ignorant, uneducated people like that. Now, this statement, I don't know if this is what Phaedrus actually thinks or not. I think what he's doing is articulating the intellectual counterpart to this desire to preserve social morality. But I think it's an example of the kind of mistake we make today. The mistake we're making more of today is that we think some of the social morals are stupid and archaic, and that completely, that they have no utility whatsoever. And this is coming up in a lot of talks in this corner as we try to understand religious morals and or explain them away with evolution or some other intellectual idea. And ivory tower elites can ponder away all they want about gender pronouns and parasitic memes, completely dismissing the social level by disparaging those who are still living in that social level as ignorant and uneducated, and they make no bones about their opinions in the movies and the news shows this elite class produce. And they're censoring this primitive ignorance from the media platforms they control, and then are in utter shock when the Capitol is stormed by someone dressed up as a Viking, representing a tribalism that we, the educated elite, fail to engage with. So we are completely isolating the social level. And since these people who are living in the social level, more in the social level than in the intellectual, since we dismiss them and have already decided that the intellectual level is not available to these people and we're not going to engage with them on an intellectual level, there's the resurgence of tribalism. And so this is a big mess, and this is a big problem. Just as a society that weakens its people's physical health endangers its own stability, so does an intellectual pattern that weakens and destroys the health of its social base also endanger its own stability. This is exactly what we see happening. This has been a century of fantastic intellectual growth and fantastic social destruction. The only question is how long this process can keep on. So, let's end with the dynamism of Lila, that unpredictability. Lila's face appeared again in the hatchway. "I feel a little better now," she said. She didn't look better. Her face had been changed with cosmetics into something worse, a kind of mask. Skin white with powder, alien black eyebrows perjured by her blonde hair, a menacing death's door eyeshadow. So, Pirsig is not only a great philosopher, he's a great writer. So what's next for this gal? Stay tuned. Hope that made sense, and I will see you next time.